Welcome to part 23 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and start building our game world with Tiled. Now that we've finished setting up our collision layers, it's time for us to start working with our tiled objects. Our tiled objects are a way for us to add additional metadata to our level, and we'll be able to import that in through our JSON file. For our first piece of metadata, we'll work on defining our room structures for our dungeon. And so what this will look like for our rooms is we're going to define a new object layer in Tiled, and on that object layer, we can add a bunch of different objects. For our rooms, we're going to create an object that represents each of our rooms in our dungeon. And then on each of these objects, we can define our properties like our X and Y, our width and height, and we'll use that to set our width and height of each of our rooms. We'll then be able to use that metadata when we import our JSON data into our Phaser game. We'll be able to use that width and height to define our bounds for our camera for a particular room. We can then add additional custom properties to each of our objects, and this allows us to assign an ID to each of our rooms, and that's how we'll be able to then transition between our rooms later on when we add in our doors. And so the main takeaway for objects is these are just a way for us to pass additional metadata in our tile map that we can use in our game. When it comes to rendering out our level, we won't actually render out this object. Instead, we're going to use it just to keep track of where our player's at in our level. And this will make more sense once we import our JSON data into our Phaser game. So now to get started with our changes, let's add a new layer. We're going to do an object layer. We're going to call this rooms. So now to create objects on our object layer, we have a few different options available to us. We can use basic shapes to define an area for our object, which will give us things like our X and Y or width and height. We could do things like a point, which would give us just our X and Y values, or we have different shapes available to us. We also have the option to insert tiles to represent our object, and then we can modify those tiles' dimensions. And so this will be the approach that we take for our rooms. We'll choose our insert tile tool. Let's choose our collision tile from our collision tile set. So now for placing our object, we're going to place that down here in our bottom left-hand corner of where our room is. What this will do is this will create an object that will have the width and the height of our tile that we used to create that object. And now our tiles will be positioned at 0 and 240 for our Y. Now to create the dimensions of our room, we'll want to update our width and height of our object. And so for our width, we'll want to do 256. And then for our height, we'll want to do 224. And so once we change our width and height properties, our object should be updated, and now it should cover up our whole room. And so I'm just going to update the opacity for our room layer here so we can still see our room under it. And now we just need to repeat this process for the other rooms in our dungeon. To make this a little bit simpler, I'm going to choose our select object tool. Let's choose our room. I'm going to copy it. And now if we paste it, we should get a copy of our object. And now we can just drag this object over our other room in our dungeon. Now I'm just going to repeat this pattern so we create each of our rooms. And now for our last room, we just need to update our height to match the dimension of our room. So now for our height, this should be 464 pixels. Once we finish creating our 6 room objects, our tile map should now look like this. For each of our objects, we now want to add in our custom property, our ID, of our room. So now to add custom properties in Tiled, we need to choose our object that we want to modify. Over our inspector, we can then hit this plus icon to add a new property to our object. So now in the modal that appears, we can choose our type for our property, and so we have the built-in types for our basic variables like a boolean, an integer, object, or a string. For our ID property, we want to do an integer, and now we can add in the name of our property. So we're going to call this ID. Once we do this, we'll have our new custom property show up, and now we can add in our value that we like to use. And so with this approach, we would need to manually add all of our custom properties one by one to each of our objects. Another option is for each of our objects, we can assign a class to that object. This class allows us to define which properties must exist on this object, and then it will automatically add those for us. As an example, if we choose one of our room objects, and from our dropdown if we choose room, we should now see our ID property gets added to our object, and right now it's grayed out because it has our default value of 0. And so we can override this by clicking and adding our value, and now we'll see our custom property turns white to show we overrided that value. And so how our class types work is in tiled, if we go up to our menu and we do view, we do custom types editor, this editor allows us to define custom types we want to use for our project. These custom types allow us to create classes, which then will allow us to create all those properties we want on that object type. We can also do things like add custom enums that allow us to define our values we want for that enum, and now when we choose that property type, we will be restricted to those values. And so in your tiled project, if you don't see this list of custom types, I included an exported version of our types that you can now import. So if you do import, in our tiled folder, there's this property types JSON file. If you import that now, this should now add in all these custom types for our project. And so what I did is for each of our objects, I defined a class, and on that class, I added in our properties that we'll need for our game. So as an example for our room object, the only thing we need right now is an ID for each of our rooms, and so we have this property here. And so how classes work is if we do add class, I'm just going to call this test, we can then define our members for that class, and so if I do the plus icon here, we now get that same modal where we can choose our property type that we want to use. And so as an example, if I wanted to add an ID property, I would choose int, I'd hit OK, and now we have a default value that will be added to all of our classes. So now if I close out of here and I come back into our inspector, now in my dropdown, my new class should appear, test. So I'm going to change this back to room. I'm going to go back into our custom types editor, and now we can define as many properties as we want for our class. What's really cool is when you define these custom classes and these custom enums, these become types that we can now reference. So as an example, if I did my door type, I'm just going to call, for this I'm just going to do test. What this will do is this is going to reference our door type enum, and now from our dropdown, we'll have our available options from our enum. And so now to create an enum, we do the same thing. So we'll do add enum, we add a name for our enum, and now we can choose our enum type, either a string or a number, and then we just add in our values that we want to use. So I can do like test1, we could do test2, and then in our classes, we can add that as one of our types. And so now if I do my enum6, I'm going to call this test2, we'll see our enum values show up here. I'm going to go ahead and remove those classes and those enums from our project. All right, and so for the time being, we're not going to dive into each of these custom types, and we'll go over these as we start creating those types of objects. For the time being, our main class we want to focus on is our room, since that gives us our ID property, and now we can update those on our objects. So let's close out of our custom types editor. We'll want to make sure we choose our room for our class type, and we'll want to have our ID of our room up here to be 1, and now we'll do the same thing down here, and we'll do our room, but now we want to do 2, and now we'll do 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so once we're done, each of our rooms should now have our custom class type with our ID populated with the appropriate value. So now that we're done with our rooms objects, I'm going to lock that layer so we don't modify it, and I'm going to hide that layer from our project. Now that we've finished setting up our collision layers and defining the structure for each of our rooms in our dungeon, it's time for us to move on to our other interactive object types. So now we'll focus on creating our object layers to represent our elements like our doors, our chests, our traps, and our enemies in our dungeon. So now for each of our object types, we're going to create these as object layers, and we're going to group them together based on our room that those objects belong to. To do this, we're going to use our group layer to create a group for our rooms, and then we'll have a subgroup for each of our room IDs, followed by our object layers with those relevant objects. And so by structuring our project this way, it'll make it easier while we're working with our objects in our Phaser game. So to get started, let's make a new group layer. We're going to call this rooms. And so now we need to create a group layer for each of our rooms. Let's do a new group layer. We're going to call this group layer 1. Let's drag that group into our rooms group. So now it should be a subgroup. And now I'm going to choose this duplicate layer option here. Let's duplicate our room so we have 6 rooms in total. And now I'm just going to update our ordering. So we'll put 1 at the top, and then we'll do 2, we'll do 3, 4, 5, and 6. We'll get rid of this extra one. And now for each of our group layers, now we'll create our object layers with our various objects. All right, so now for each of our rooms, we're going to start off by defining our door objects that exist in that room. So in our group layer for our room 1, let's do a new object layer. We're going to call this doors. Let's drag that object layer into our group layer 1. So for our tile door objects, in our level, these are meant to represent areas in our level where when our player collides with it, our player can then transition to another part of our level or to another level altogether. How this looks in our existing dungeon is we're going to add a door object to each of our doors where our player can move from this room to another room. Besides moving to another room in our dungeon, we want to add our door to our dungeon entrance, which acts as a trigger to move our player from our dungeon to our world level. And so now for each of our tile door objects, we're going to need properties to keep track of which door or level this door connects to. So as an example, this door's ID is 2, and it currently connects to our target door ID of 1 inside our room 4. So now if we come over to room 4 and we click this door here, we'll see our ID is 1, and so this matches our target door ID from this door here. By adding these properties, it allows us to know where we need to transition our player to in our dungeon. We also add in properties like which direction our player needs to head in order to move to our next door. And so for this door here, we're going to move in the direction right. This door here, we need to move in our direction left. Finally, because these doors also represent the doors in our dungeon, we also have this door type enum here. So if I go up to our custom types editor and we go into our door type, we'll see our various doors for our dungeon include an open door, and so this is a door our player can always move through. We'll have a locked door, which requires our player to use a small key to open it up. Our trap door will be a door that will be opened when either our player defeats all the enemies in our room, or they press a button to unlock that trap. Our boss door is our door that requires our boss key to get to our boss. And then finally, our open entrance. This indicates that this is the entrance into our current level, and so the entrance to our dungeon. Finally, if our door is a trapdoor type, we add this trapdoor trigger property. This trapdoor trigger property indicates which type of trap must be completed in order to open this door. And so for our door, it can be either opened by a switch or by all of our enemies being defeated. And so we would set this value when our door type is our trapdoor. Before placing objects in our dungeon rooms, we first need to finalize our level's design and mechanics. Using our guide image as a reference, we already have the dungeon layout in place. Now, we need to determine what objects and interactive elements belong in each room. To make this easier, I've already mapped out the key elements for each space. When designing your own levels, planning these details early helps ensure a balanced and engaging experience. This includes not only room layouts, but also enemy placements, key items, traps, and of course, the dungeon boss. Before we start adding objects to our room, let's take a moment to review the overall design and see how everything connects. For our dungeon, this consists of 6 rooms. Our goal of our dungeon is our player needs to find our boss key and defeat the boss enemy in our level. As our player navigates between each of our rooms, they're going to encounter a variety of different objects and enemies that they'll be able to interact with. So for our dungeon, our player is going to start off in our room ID 3, so our bottom left-hand room of our map. When our player enters into our dungeon, they're going to see 2 doors. Our first door to the top will be our boss door, and this will be locked and require our boss key in order to unlock it. Our door to our right is going to be unlocked, and so our player can navigate to our room 4. When our player enters our room, this is going to trigger a trap. This trap is going to close our door that our player just entered, and on the right-hand side, we'll have a locked door that the player requires a key. Inside this room, there's going to be 2 enemies. These will be our wisp enemies, and so they're going to be bouncing around our room, and our player needs to avoid them while they solve this puzzle. And so to solve our puzzle, there'll be 4 switches inside this room. And so when our player steps on our switch, it'll do one of 3 things. If they step on the switches on the left, they're not going to do anything, and if they step on our bottom right-hand switch, this will be our trigger to open up our trap door. So if the player steps on the top right switch, this is going to reveal a hidden chest inside our room. This chest will have our small key, and so when our player opens up that chest, they'll now be able to use that key to unlock this door here. Now, our player will be able to move to our next room, and so now when our player enters our next room, this will trigger another trap. For this trap, it's going to close both of our doors, and our player needs to hit our switch on our floor here in order to open those doors. Inside this room, there'll be a chest that's immediately visible to our player, and there's going to be one hidden chest as well. If our player picks up one of our pots and then steps on that switch, this will reveal our other chest. So inside this chest, our player will be able to collect our map and our compass items for our dungeon. And then when our player moves to our room ID 6, now they're going to be greeted with a variety of different enemies. So in this room, we're going to have 4 of our spider enemies spawn, as well as 2 of our wisp. And so besides our enemies, as soon as our player enters this room, this is going to trigger another trap, and that's going to close our trap door. In order to unlock this trap door, our player will need to lift up this pot and step on our floor switch. Inside this room, our player will see our boss chest, and they won't be able to open it until they find our boss key. Now if our player defeats our 4 spider enemies, this is going to reveal a hidden chest in the top right hand corner, and this is going to have our boss key. Now our player can use that key to open up our boss chest, and so for our current level, this won't have anything inside it, but if we add in a second weapon, we can now place that inside our chest. So now with our boss key, our player can now navigate back to our room ID 3. For this, as our player re-enters our rooms, our trap's going to re-trigger, and so our player will need to step on those switches, and so as they step on each switch, they'll open the doors until they get back to room ID 3. Once here, our player can interact with their boss door, and when they come up here, they're going to have one more challenge room before they make their way to their boss. And so when our player enters this room, this is going to trigger another trap, and this will close both of our doors. For our room, we're going to have 1 wisp enemy and 2 spider enemies. Once our player clears our 2 spider enemies, that's going to unlock both of our doors here. And so how we'll set up our dungeon is when our player defeats our enemies, when they leave that room and come back, those enemies will not respawn. So if our player came back down to room 3 and then back up to room 2, our doors would no longer lock, and they'll be unlocked for our player to progress to our boss room. Finally, when we get to room ID 1, this is where our boss will be located, and so our boss will teleport into our room, and this will start our boss fight. When our player enters this room, this is going to trigger another trap, and this trap will be tied to us defeating our boss before our player can leave. With our dungeon design fully mapped out, let's switch back to tiled and start placing our objects. So now we'll focus on adding all of our door objects to our dungeon. For this, we'll need to create an object layer for each of our rooms, so we already have our doors object layer for our room ID 1. Let's add an object layer to each of our other rooms. For that, I'm just going to duplicate our layer 5 times. And now we're just going to place a copy of our doors into each of our other rooms. Now we'll just update our layer names. So we're just going to call this doors. I'm going to copy that. So now we'll focus on getting our objects placed, and then we'll come back and update their properties. So now for each of our door objects, we're going to place that at the top of each of our doors. So now to start placing our objects, let's choose our door layer that's tied to our room 1. Let's choose our insert tile tool. We'll grab our collision tile. We're going to place that down here in the bottom left hand corner of our door. Alright, so for our object, let's update our width. We're going to do 32 pixels. And now for our height, we only want this to be half of our current size, and so for our height, we'll make this 8 pixels. And now we just need to update our positioning. So for our object, this is currently in the bottom half of one of our tiles, we want it to be in our top half. For that, we need to update our Y value, and so we're going to subtract 8 pixels from it, and so we'll do 232. Once we do that, our door object should be in this position, and now we should see the top of our door visible behind our object. So now for our object, let's add in our door class. And for the time being, we'll just leave our properties alone, and let's create the rest of our objects. So now if we click on our door object, let's copy it. Let's go to our door object layer for room 2, and now we'll want to paste in 2 instances of our object. We'll paste one at the top of our door here, and then one down at the bottom. And now we'll need to update our positioning, so we want to subtract 8 pixels from this. So we'll have 488. And now we want to do the same thing for our next room, so we'll go to room. Next, let's move on to room 3. Let's choose our layer. We'll paste in our door. Now we just need to add in our door for our right-hand door here. So if we paste in our object, we'll need to update our width and our height. So for our height, we'll want this to be 32 pixels, and then for our width, we want this to be 8 pixels. So now if we take our object, we should be able to move it over the top of our door. Let's copy that object instance, and now let's move to our next room. So now for our door on our left, we just need to update our X position. So we'll add 8 pixels to it, so it should be 280. Let's move to our next room. We'll update our position, so we'll have 536. Finally, we'll go to our last room, and then we'll have 792. Now for each of our door objects, we need to update our relevant properties. So starting in room 6, for our door, our direction, we're going to move to the left. Our door type, this is going to be our trap door. Since it's our trap door, we need to set our trigger, and this is going to be a switch. Now for our door ID, we're going to do door ID 1 since it's the only door in our room. And now we need to choose our target door that this door connects to. And so this will be our door ID 2, and it'll be our target room, and we'll do 5. Since this door just connects to another door in our dungeon, we can leave our is level transition and target level blank. So now let's go over to room 5. For our door on our left, we'll have our direction go left. Our door type, this will be a trap door. Our trigger will be our switch. Our door ID will be 1. Our target door ID will be 2. And for our target room ID, this will be 4. So now for our right-hand door, we'll update our ID to be 2. And so now this is important. Since this door connects to this door here, we need to make sure the ID of this door matches our target door ID that we provide here. So now for our door direction, we'll go right. Our door type will be a trap. It'll be our switch. Now for our target door ID, it'll be 1, since that's the ID of this door here. Now for our room ID, we'll be going to room 6. Let's move over to our next room. So we'll do our door ID, we'll do 1. We'll do a door ID of 2 here. Now for our direction on our left-hand door, we'll go left. Our door type will be our trap door. We have to do our switch. Now for our target room, this will be 3. And our door ID that we target will be 2. So now for our right-hand door, our direction will be right. Our door is going to be a locked door. So since our door is locked, let's update our door trigger. We'll set it to be none. Now for our target room ID, we'll go to room 5. Our door ID, our target door ID will be 1. Now let's move over to our next room. So for our top door, we're going to have this be an ID of 1. Our right door will be our ID of 2. And now our bottom door, this will be ID 3. Starting with our top door, we'll go in the up direction. Our door type is our boss door. We'll set our trapdoor trigger type to be none. Now for our target door ID, this will be 2, and our room ID will be 2. For our right-hand door, we'll be moving to the right. Our door type will be open. Since our door is open, there'll be no trap. Now for our target door ID, this will be 1, and our target room will be 4. Finally, for our bottom door, our direction will be down. Our door type will be our open entrance. Let's check our box for is level transition. And now for our target door ID, we'll do 1. Our target room ID will be 1. Finally, for our door, since this is transitioning to our world level, we need to check our box for is level transition. And now we need to provide our target level name. For our target level name, we're just going to do world. And so how we'll use our target level is when our player collides with our object here, we're going to use this string to know which background and foreground images to load and use for our level, as well as which JSON file for our level we're loading. As an example, when we build our world level, we're going to export out our foreground and background images with our world prefix. And then for our JSON file, we'll call this world.json. And so inside this level, when we add in our door, we'll point to our dungeon_1. And now for our dungeon 1, when we export out our foreground and background images, as well as our JSON file, we'll use that naming convention. Finally, since this is not a trap, we'll set this to be none. All right, let's move up to room 2. Our top door, we'll do our direction up. Our door type, this will be our trap door. ID will be 1. Our target door ID will be 1. Our target room ID will be 1. And our trap type will be our enemies defeated. Our bottom door will go in the direction down. Our door type will be our trap. Our ID will be 2. Our target door ID will be 1. Our target room will be 3. And this will be our enemies defeated for our door type. Finally, for our last room, this will be our boss room. And so for our door, our direction will be down. Now for our door type, this will be a trap door. Our ID will be 1. Now our target door ID will be 1. Our room will be 2. And now we want to do enemies defeated, since we don't want to leave until we defeat our boss enemy. So now with that last change, we now have all of our door objects in place for our dungeon. Since we're done with our doors, we're going to lock our door object layers to make sure we don't add any additional objects to those layers. Now that we've finished adding our door objects to our dungeon, it's time for us to work on our next object type, our switches. So for our switches, we're going to have these in 3 of our rooms in our dungeon. We'll have these in our room 4, 5, and 6. And for our switches, we're going to have 2 primary types. We're going to have a floor switch, will be like a pressure plate, where when our player steps on that tile in our dungeon, it might do something. For our second type, these are going to be buttons that are hidden under our pots in our dungeon, and so when our player lifts up our pot, they can then step on that button to do something in our room. And so for our switches, it's going to do one of three things. It's either going to do nothing for our existing room, it's going to reveal a chest, or it might open up one of our doors. Later on, this could be extended to do things like if I press a switch, it'll drop a key into our room for our player to pick up. And so before we start adding our objects, we're going to quickly review our custom types for our class. So if we go into our custom types editor, we're going to have a class that represents our switch, and on our switch, we're going to have three main properties. We're going to have action, our target IDs, and then our texture. And so our action property, this is going to keep track of what our switch can actually do. And so this is going to be our switch action enum. And so our switch can do nothing for the current room. It might open a door, it could reveal a chest, or reveal a key. Now, when our switch does something, we'll need to provide the target ID of that action. So, as an example, when we press our switch in room 6, we need to provide our target door ID of 1, so we know we need to open up this door. Versus when we're in room ID 5, if we press our switch here, we're targeting revealing a chest, and so we need to provide our chest ID of which chest we want to reveal. And for one more example, in room 5, when we press our green switch here, this is going to open up both of our trap doors, and so for our target IDs, we need to provide 1 and 2 so we can open up both of those doors. And so for our target IDs property, this will be a string, and we expect our values to be separated by a comma. Our final property, texture, this is going to be our switch texture enum, and this is going to determine which texture we want to render out in our game for this switch. So now to start adding our switch game objects, we need to add our new object layers to our rooms 4, 5, and 6. So let's make a new object layer. We're going to call this switches. I'm going to copy that name. Let's drag our layer into room 4. Now let's add in 2 more layers. So let's duplicate our layer twice. We'll drag a copy into room 5 and then a copy into room 6. And we'll update our name. So let's start in room 4. So if we choose our switch object layer for room 4, what we'll want to do is we'll want to add in 4 objects into these locations. So let's choose our insert tile. So let's choose our insert tile tool. Let's choose our collision object. And so we're going to place this 3 tiles over and then 2 tiles down. Now for our object, let's add in our switch class. For the time being, we won't populate our properties, but now let's choose our select object tool. Let's copy our object, we'll paste it, and now we'll place this on the other side of our dungeon. So 2 tiles down, 3 tiles over. And now we want to do the same thing at the bottom of our dungeon. So now we have our 4 objects. So now for our tile objects, our 2 switches on our left, these won't actually do anything. Since they're not going to do anything, we'll update our action to say nothing. For our target IDs, we'll just do our empty string. And now for our texture, these switches are going to be on our floor, so we want to choose our floor texture. Let's do the same thing for our bottom left. And so we'll do nothing. And we want to choose our floor texture. And now for our switch in our bottom right, this is going to open up our trapdoor. So if we choose our switch, for our action, we want to do open door. Now for our target ID, this needs to match our door ID here. And so it'll be our door ID of 1. Now for our texture, this is going to be our floor switch. Now finally, for our top right switch, this is going to reveal a hidden chest in our room. For our action, we want to do reveal chest. For our target ID, we'll do 1. Once we add in our chest game object, we'll want to make sure we have that same ID so we reveal the correct chest. Let's update our texture and we'll do floor. So now we can move on to our next room. Let's copy our switch object that opens up our door. We'll move over to our next room, and now we'll want to place our object right here by our door. So for this particular switch, this is going to be responsible for opening up both of our trap doors in our room ID 5. So now for our object, we want to do our action of open door. Now for our target IDs, we want to do 1, 2, and our texture will be our floor texture. Oh, and I forgot to place that in our correct room, so I'm going to make a copy of that object. I'm going to delete it. Now I'm going to choose my switches layer for room 5, and we want to paste it back in that location. So now let's make a copy of our object. We want to place it over where we're going to place our pot here. So now for this switch, it's going to be responsible for revealing one of our chests. So let's update our action. We're going to do reveal chest. And now for our target ID, this will be our chest 1. And now for our texture, we want to do our plate texture. Since this switch is going to be hidden under one of our pots, what we'll end up doing is we're going to render out this frame here in our game, and then once our player presses our button, we're going to show this frame here to show the button was pressed. Finally, let's move on to room 6. Let's copy this object here. Now we'll choose our object layer for room 6. Let's paste in our object, and we want to do that over our bottom left spot where we'll place our pods. So for our final switch, this is going to be responsible for unlocking our trapdoor in our room. So let's update our properties. We're going to do open door, our target ID will be our door 1, and we'll want to do our plate for our texture. Alright, so if we save, with our new objects, our dungeon map should look like this. Since we're done with our switches, I'm going to lock those layers so we don't place any additional objects on those layers. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.